It's a warm welcome to Africa 360. We are the program that goes beyond the headlines to bring you what you won't get anywhere else. If it's about the African continent, we'll certainly be bringing it to you here on our program. I'm Chris Maroleng, and you're watching Africa 360. In this edition, it was a historic moment that ushered in a non-racial democracy that led to the creation of a rainbow nation. But almost 20 years into that democracy, South Africa still grapples with racial integration challenges. This week on Africa 360, we bring you views of South Africa's white Afrikaans-speaking community as we assess the state of race relations in that country. All this and more coming up right here on Africa 360. Well, South Africa made the transition from the racial segregation of apartheid to a non-racial democracy almost 2 decades ago. But the country is still grappling with the challenges of racial integration. Some South African blacks and indeed some whites still struggle to be part of what's being called the Rainbow Nation, with a new and controversial documentary currently just about to make its debut entitled Fatherland. The question being asked is, to what extent do white Afrikaans speaking people in their communities experience this elusive rainbow nation? Some say they feel disenfranchised and not welcome in South Africa. eNCA's Janae Hale takes a look.
In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party gained control of the government. Most were Afrikaans-speaking. Apartheid, meaning separateness, became official policy. But it was far from equitable. Whites had better education, medical care, beaches, transportation, and other public services. During this time, there was a small vocal Afrikaans-speaking opposition to apartheid. But apartheid could not last. And F.V. de Klerk officially abolished it, paving the way for a free South Africa. In 1994, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president. Apartheid policies were abolished and affirmative action was instituted.
In 1994, most white South Africans were policemen, soldiers, and they worked for government. Today they have low unemployment, and most of them, the vast majority of them, maybe 95% of those who work for themselves. They're much richer than they've ever been before. They're 64% more richer than they've been in 1994.
But almost 2 decades on, and many Afrikaners still feel a sense of guilt.
When we are in a group and everyone can speak both Afrikaans and English, then I speak Afrikaans.
There were Indian ones, there were colored ones, white ones, and Zulu ones.
Humor has become a way to bridge the divide. Still, resentment against Afrikaans-speaking whites is still very much a reality. Pockets of cult-like organizations who still live in the past certainly doesn't help democracy. Afrikaners, along with all South Africans, share similar concerns. Buzzy Wilson probably sums it up best.
I am not a brother and sister of the black people, but we are human beings.
Janae Hale, Johannesburg.
Well, thank you, Janae, for that report. The controversial new documentary Fatherland, produced and directed by filmmaker Taryn Lee Crosman, explores some of the issues related to the state of race relations in this country, particularly the fine line between patriotism and racism. The movie is a hard and unscripted look inside the Kommandokorps military boot camps that are being run in some Afrikaner rural communities in South Africa. Let's have a look at the trailer of that documentary.
Right, kom, triad! Jy gaan op 'n 9 daar kom. Hardloop, hardloop, beweeg, beweeg, beweeg. Julle is nou by die Kommandokorps.
Nasionale! Saluit! Uit die blou van ons hemel, uit die diepte van ons see, oor ons ewige gebied.
Die lesing wat ek vandag van julle gaan gee, is seker die belangrikste lesing. Die vyand en die bedreiging. Jy kan nie in hierdie land leef as jy nie weet wie is jou vyand. Wie verkrag elke 15 sekondes 'n vrou in Suid-Afrika? Wie het al ongeveer 2000 boere in Suid-Afrika vermoor? Wie is hierdie wesens? En julle moet dit vir my sê.
In die Bybel staan, swart mense moet by swart mense bly en wit mense moet by wit mense bly. As hulle net hulle op hulle kant kan hou en ek op my kant, dan is daar mos nie 'n probleem nie.
South Africa is bleeding. And this is why we have to train our people to be prepared for any attack, anywhere. Daar's 'n konflik tussen wit mense en swart mense in hierdie land. Ons moet dit net aanvaar.
You get black people that are extremists, and then you get white people that are extremists. So they are in conflict with each other, and the middle groups are just going like sheep. I'm not an extremist, so I'm one of the sheep.
They've been indoctrinating our children since 1994, telling them about the so-called Rainbow Nation, and they couldn't be very successful if every time we've got these camps, we change it in 9 days' time, and then these kids see that they belong to a different nation, very proud nation.
Wow, some very interesting stuff coming out of that documentary, Fatherland, and that was produced by Taryn Lee Crosman. Taryn, I was both gripped and disturbed by aspects of your documentary. What motivates a lot of these young lads, and I would imagine their parents, to send them to such camps for what essentially is military training?
Yeah, I mean, the camps are built for self-defense. So you know that there's a lot of crime in the farming communities in South Africa. So the camps are built as a disciplined boot camp to make your boys men, because there's no longer conscription. So a lot of the fathers are quite excited about their boys becoming men. And then the other thing is self-defense. So a lot of these boys live on the farms and are sent to the camps so they can protect their families.
Yeah. It sounds like it's premised around the notion that a lot of these rural communities feel unsafe where they stay. Yeah. They feel besieged, probably disenfranchised by the situation in which they find themselves in. But something else is concerning about this, as far as I'm concerned, in that it could very well turn out to be not just defense, but possibly aggression.
Well, they say during the camp, Franz says it quite a lot, that they're not training the boys to attack, they're training the boys to defend. But they also say throughout the camp, I didn't want to reveal this because you'll see it in the film, but I mean, a big part of the ideology is that the Kommandokorps do not believe that black and white should live in the same space. Yeah. That they should not be, they do not want to be governed by people they don't believe are of the same. They believe black people are inferior to white people. So they don't want to be governed by black people. They want their own land. They want to be governed by the Afrikaans culture. They want their culture to be the way that their country is run. So they want their own land, and they want a land that is governed by. What
is apparent, though, Taryn, is that they really seem to be creating or generating a military force here, irrespective of whether it's for defensive purposes or for aggression. But what remains is that it's a military force, and therefore I would imagine we should be concerned.
I honestly can't say whether you should be concerned about the Kommandokorps or not. Like when I was there, I did feel they're a small minority group, but they are doing military training. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. And they do, I mean, this is the first basics. They do different camps. This is just one of the camps. They do weekend camps where they do various arms. So they do shooting, so we train to use a loaded firearm. And as you graduate, you get into more and more kind of security skills to defend your family.
But what was interesting also is I saw one of the trainers pointing a gun directly at one of these young lads who were brought in for training. That must be a harrowing experience for any one. But I imagine even those guys who are doing the training.
They're feisty, these boys, you know, and they also, it's a group of boys. Like, you're going to be a man, you're never going to be, you know. So even Dion, where the young boy that you see with the gun's not loaded, but with the gun to his head, being taught how to disarm if somebody's attacking him. Dion's only was like 14 or 15 at the time, and he was fine. They actually quite enjoyed the training.
Interesting. Enjoying the training there. We were in discussion with Taryn. She's the producer of that documentary, Fatherland. Do join us after the break, because when we come back, I'll be taking the discussion further with two guests. And this is only on Africa 360.
Since 1994, there's been 2,000 murders on our people.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. Today we're focusing on the state of race relations in South Africa, specifically getting the views of some of the white Afrikaans speaking community on the question of this elusive rainbow nation for many in South Africa. Joining me now to take our conversation a little further is Dr. Piet Croucamp. He's from the University of Johannesburg, and also joining us from our Pretoria studios is Mr. Franz Jooste, and he's the executive director of the Kommandokorps, the group that you saw in the trailer of the Fatherland documentary. Let me start with you, Mr. Jooste. Once again, thank you for joining us. We just watched what to me was a very disturbing program that showed paramilitary training and indeed indoctrination of young men during the Kommandokorps training. What motivates this kind of training by you and by the Kommandokorps?
I think the thing that motivates us most is the farm murders. We train these guys to do self-defense, but we also have to learn them ideology behind all these murders. Why they do these murders and why they commit these murders on our people. So we take them to these camps, train them. There's various lessons that we give them. But what we do actually is to learn them to defend themselves and their loved ones.
You refer here to an ideology around the murders. It's almost as if you are implying that there is some kind of, in your view, a genocide or targeted attacks specifically on the white Afrikaans-speaking community by blacks. Is that correct?
There is definitely a genocide on our people. There's more than 2,000 farmers that's been murdered since 1994. And you remember 1994 is when the world started. Nothing happened before 1994. Everything started in 1994. But since 1994, there's been 2,000 murders on our people. And we have to train our people to be ready for this.
How would you respond to my claim, if I put it to you, that in actual fact the statistics that we have present before us seem to indicate that in actual fact the white Afrikaans speaking community, or whites specifically as a demographic group, are less likely to be murdered or attacked when compared to people living in mainly impoverished communities who are principally black or non-white?
Well, it's obvious, because the blacks are more in numbers. And because they are more in numbers, the statistics will show that more of them are likely to be killed.
Now, does that also indicate, or can we take it from your statement to indicate a lack of faith in the state security forces of the current South African government, that is the police, the intelligence forces and others, to ensure the community or safety of communities in rural South Africa?
They cannot protect us. The South African police nor the South African Defence Force can protect us. We have to take measures to protect ourselves.
Let me bring in Dr. Croucamp here. Some interesting views coming across from the head of the Kommandokorps. He says that there is a genocide against white people in South Africa, and it's being done by blacks. Is this a view that is commonly held amongst the white Afrikaner community?
No, I think the view is a little bit more informed than that, and we know that the so-called ideology according to which black South Africans attack white South Africans only exist in far right-wing, lunatic, fringe type of organizations. The vast majority of white South Africans understand that this is criminal. It's high levels of crime, and that white farmers live in remote areas. There's a perception that they have arms, that they have money, and that is the motivation for the crime against them. It makes them vulnerable, and it is true that the South African police do not have the capacity to protect them, which actually makes them more vulnerable. But there's not a single shred of evidence that black South Africans in some or other way conform to a type of conspiracy or ideology to attack white South Africans. What is happening is that people like Franz is designing this ideology to give some sort of justification for their own racial prejudices. If you look at that video that you've just shown earlier, there's no doubt that what they're trying to do is they try to impose a very specific racial disposition on the minds of those kids. And let me tell you this, we saw when the Boerenmag was sentenced, there were 3 children there from one family. That is what is happening when you do what Franz is doing. I can tell you now, some of those kids in that video, and the parents can prepare them for that, some of those kids will end up in jail because they will be criminal and because they will do things in a very amateur way. They're not soldiers in the same way that I think he behaves like a very amateur soldier. They're not soldiers, they will behave in a way which will make them end up in jail for some lunatic ideology, and they don't deserve that adults do that to them.
Do join us after the break as we continue our discussion on the state of race relations and the activities of the shadowy operations known as the Kommandokorps, and that's only on Africa 360.
The criminals that attack the farmers is also the criminals that attack black people in South Africa.
Welcome back if you're just joining us. This is Africa 360. This week we are in conversation about the state of race relations in Africa, particularly following the release of a controversial documentary known as the Fatherland. I'm currently joined in our studios here in Johannesburg by Dr. Piet Croucamp. He's from the University of Johannesburg. And joining us in our Pretoria studios is Mr. Franz Jooste, and he is the Executive Director of the Kommandokorps. Let me start with you, Mr. Jooste. One of the interesting things that we have noted is that your ideology almost seems to deny the fact that there is a unified South Africa. It's premised on the fact that the ethnic groups and the various racial groups in our country are actually divided. What's your view on this?
Well, the Rainbow Nation is a myth. It was created artificially by politicians so that they can get more votes and thus gets more money and can create more corruption.
This type of conspiracy theory, it can only go on in somebody who's got no understanding of politics, no understanding of the economy, no understanding of the natural activities and relationships within the civil society. I think let me just finish.
I've got a distinction in politics.
Let's let Dr. Croucamp finish.
Obviously, he's got very little understanding of politics. In South Africa, we know, and we've done the surveys, we know the research shows that there is considerable consensus abroad. Sections of subpopulation in South Africa, which we can call middle-class values. The main problem of white South Africans is bad service delivery and corruption and crime. If we look at the black subpopulations, you know what is the main concern? Bad service delivery, corruption and crime. There's a broad consensus, and I'm not one of those who try to sell the idea of a rainbow nation, but I think there's a growing consensus about the greater good in South Africa. And the idea, the very uninformed idea, an ideology that Franz trying to sell, and what he does is he takes this ideology and he militarizes it, and he creates an enemy that does not exist, and then he labels that enemy black people. What is happening is the criminals that attack the farmers is also the criminals that attack black people in South Africa.
Given what we've heard from Dr. Croucamp, Mr. Jooste, I must ask you, what will it take to bring people like yourselves and those who subscribe to this vision of a divided South Africa back into the mainstream, back into South Africa? Because this is surely what will work. Yes, sir. Tell us.
I've got an answer to that. We must just accept that we are different. We are not all the same. I mean, you are not the same than I am. I'm not the same than Dr. Croucamp. We are not the same. We are different nations. There's about 11 nations in this country. And we, as Afrikaner people, we want our own land. What we ask for the ANC is did to us what we did to you in the 70s and the 80s. Give us a homeland. Our own land, where we can be independent. It's the right of every nation in this world, according to the United Nations, that they can be independent.
But sir,
so we also, as a nation,
what
wants
if,
to be independent.
What if I put it to you that yes, we are different, and that difference and diversity is our strength. But what is important is that in actual fact, as South Africans, we are one nation. And you, sir, do not represent the views.
African.
You do not represent the views of all Afrikaners quite clearly today.
I represent the view of about 1 million Afrikaners.
No, there's
and 1 million Afrikaners is enough.
No, there's no evidence. There's no evidence that these militarized views represent 1 million Afrikaners. He's got no data that will show that. What data you'll probably find is that it's a very small group of people. You remember when they had the Red October March, 300 people turned up and 200 of them probably arrived because Steve Hofmeyer was there. There's no momentum in the ideology that he's trying to selling. Even if we find a solution and we give them a homeland somewhere, the fact is 99% of us still have to keep on living in South Africa because we want to, and not because we do not want to follow him to Iran now.
I live along with a lot of black people that I know, and especially Indian people that I know. But I've got a right to be independent. I've got a right to strive for independence. Now, that is internationally known.
Let's assume that's right. Let's assume that's right. But that right, then you have to live somewhere else and not in South Africa. If you don't feel welcome in South Africa, go somewhere else. The fact is, the rest of us, white South Africans, black South Africans that live here, is not prepared to cut up a piece of land to give to a small group of people who have tried to militarize their ideology, who try to spread racial hatred. We don't want them in South Africa. They can find a homeland somewhere else.
If you don't want me here, Dr. Croucamp, then I want my own country in South Africa, because this is my land as well. As it's been, it can be a Zulu's land, it can be a Xhosa's land, it's also my land. But little countries like Swaziland and Lesotho exists next to us. So we can also have our country in the middle of South Africa, in the center of South Africa, not somewhere in the desert.
But so, what if I put it to you this way, that in actual fact, the qualitative relationship that I have with many Afrikaans-speaking people is very important, because they consider themselves, as their name defines it, as Africans. And therefore, having said that, most of them, I would put it to you, don't want to live somewhere else apart from fellow Africans. They actually want to be part of a unified Africa. Why can't you be part of us, sir?
But more and more of them don't want to be part of this mess in South Africa. All this murders, all this crime, all this corruption in this country. They don't, more and more people wants to be independent and wants to, different from these people, wants to be different from the so-called Rainbow Nation that does not exist.
There's no evidence for it. Chris, it's true that more and more people are tired of crime and corruption, but it's black and white South Africans are tired of crime and corruption. The fact is, the number of people who want to be independent is insignificant. You cannot measure them on any large scale. It's a small group of people, and what concerns me is if you say that I want to be independent is one thing. If you militarize that ideology, that is what you get when you get the boeremacht. That is dangerous when you do that to children. That is the danger of South Africa. Ideally, people like France should be very closely monitored, because we cannot trust people who seek to undermine with some disruptive ideology the rest of the growing and slowly growing consensus and compromise in South Africa.
That does bring us to the end of this episode of Africa 360. We certainly hope you enjoyed our debate looking into race relations here on Africa 360. If you'd like to join the debate on Africa, you can certainly do so by joining us on Facebook, or you can follow us on Twitter, or drop us an email on africa360@enca.com. And remember, you are the voice of Africa, and we'd certainly like to hear from you in upcoming editions of our program, Africa 360. So until next time, when we look forward to bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before, do take care. Thank you, sir.